Imagine you have a good life, a stable job, respect, security. You work in one of the most powerful palaces on earth, serving the most powerful man alive. And then one afternoon, a letter arrives. It contains news from home, not just bad news, catastrophic news. Your city, the place your ancestors built, the place where everything your people believed in once stood, is rubble. The walls that protected it for centuries, demolished. The gates, burned to ash. The people who still live there, living in disgrace. Hunted, mocked, forgotten. Most people would read that letter, fold it up, and get back to work. Because what could they do? They were hundreds of miles away. They had no army, no funding, no political power. They were, by every measure, the wrong person for the job. But this man, this cupbearer, this servant, he read that letter, and he wept. And then he decided to rebuild an entire city against an empire's worth of opposition in 52 days. To understand Nehemiah, you have to understand the world he inherited, not chose. Inherited. Nehemiah didn't grow up in Jerusalem. He grew up in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, the most dominant superpower of the ancient world. He was Jewish, the descendant of people who had been conquered, exiled, and scattered across foreign lands decades before he was even born. His people had once had everything: a kingdom, a temple, a covenant. And then the Babylonians came. They burned Jerusalem to the ground in 587 BC. They tore apart the Temple of Solomon, one of the greatest architectural achievements in human history, stone by stone. They marched the Jewish people in chains into exile. That was the world Nehemiah was born into. Not as a soldier, not as a prince, as a servant. His official title was Cupbearer to the king, specifically King Artaxerxes I of Persia. Now, that title sounds almost insignificant, like a glorified butler. But here's what most people don't realize. The cupbearer to a Persian king was one of the most trusted men in the entire empire. Poisoning was the preferred method of political assassination in the ancient world. Rivals, enemies, even family members, all were willing to slip something deadly into a royal cup. The cupbearer's job was to taste the king's wine before he drank it, to put his own life on the line. Every single day, that required an extraordinary level of trust. Nehemiah wasn't just a servant. He was a confidant, an insider. He had access to the king's ear, to the king's table, to the king's favor. And he had spent years building that trust, quietly, faithfully, while his people suffered hundreds of miles away. He could have used that position to do almost anything. Enrich himself, advance his family, simply survive. Instead, the moment the news arrived from Jerusalem, everything changed. His name was Hanani, Nehemiah's brother. He arrived in Susa in the month of Chislev, late November, early December. Nehemiah hadn't seen him in years, perhaps longer. And the first question Nehemiah asked wasn't about family. It wasn't about health or travel or news of old friends. He asked about Jerusalem, about the Jewish remnant who had returned from exile, about the city. And Hanani told him the truth. The survivors were in great trouble and disgrace. The walls of Jerusalem had been broken down. The gates had been burned with fire. That was the whole report, a handful of words. But those words destroyed him. The book of Nehemiah records what happened next with startling rawness. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed. Not hours, not one evening, days. Here is a man at the height of his influence, trusted by the most powerful king in the world, sitting on the floor of the Persian palace, weeping. Why did it hit him so hard? Because he understood what broken walls meant. In the ancient world, a city without walls wasn't just inconvenient. It was defenseless. It was an open invitation to attack, to raid, to humiliate. It sent a message to every surrounding nation. These people have no protection. Do with them what you will. Jerusalem without walls wasn't just a construction problem. It was a public declaration that God's people were finished, and Nehemiah couldn't live with that. So he did the only thing he knew to do first. He prayed. He confessed. He wrestled. He reminded God of his own promises. And then, buried at the end of that prayer, he added something almost audacious. He prayed for favor with the king, because already, before he had a plan, before he had resources, before he had permission, Nehemiah knew what he was going to do. He was going to Jerusalem. For months past, for months of waiting, of carrying the weight of Jerusalem in silence. Because you didn't just walk up to the king of Persia and ask to leave. You waited for the right moment. And then the moment arrived. Nehemiah was doing his job, serving wine, and something gave him away. Maybe it was the shadows under his eyes. Maybe it was the slight tremor in his hands. The king looked at him and asked why his face looked so sad when he wasn't ill. This was dangerous. You did not show sadness in the presence of the Persian king. The ancient court operated on a simple principle. Your loyalty to the king superseded all personal feelings. You were not a person in his presence. You were a function. Nehemiah himself admits he was very much afraid. And yet he didn't lie. He didn't deflect. He looked the most powerful man in the world in the eye and told him the truth. That the city where his ancestors were buried lay in ruins. That its gates had been destroyed by fire. The king leaned forward and asked what he wanted. And here, right here, is the moment that defines Nehemiah. Because before he answered, he prayed. Not a long prayer, not a formal prayer, a breath, a heartbeat, a silent cry upward. And then he asked for everything. Permission to travel to Judah, letters of safe passage, letters to the keeper of the royal forest authorizing timber for the gates and the walls. He didn't ask for a little help. He laid out an entire project plan in front of the king. And the king said yes to all of it. Because the gracious hand of God was on him, the king granted his requests. He was given an armed escort. He was given letters from the most powerful empire on earth. He was going to Jerusalem. He arrived quietly. No announcement. No fanfare. He had been in Jerusalem for 3 days before he told anyone what he was planning. 3 days of watching, listening, getting a feel for the landscape. Not just the physical ruins, but the political landscape. Because Jerusalem was not a safe place. There were enemies watching. 3 names dominate the opposition in Nehemiah's story. Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, a political heavyweight who saw Nehemiah's mission as a direct threat to his own influence. Tobiah, an Ammonite official, cunning, well-connected, deeply embedded in Jerusalem's social fabric. And Geshem, an Arab leader of considerable power. These 3 men would spend the coming weeks doing everything they could to stop what Nehemiah was about to start. But Nehemiah wasn't ready to confront them yet. First, he needed to see it for himself. So in the middle of the night, with a small group of trusted men and a single animal beneath him, Nehemiah rode out alone into the darkness. He went to the valley gate. He passed the jackal well. He moved toward the dung gate. He inspected the broken walls, the burned gates. He rode through rubble so dense that his animal couldn't find footing. He was silent. He was alone. He was taking the full measure of the disaster. And when morning came, he gathered the people. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't give them a rousing speech. He showed them the ruins. He told them of his own grief. And then he said what no one else had said in all the years since the walls had fallen. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. Not you, not them, us. And something that had been dormant for decades, some deep, forgotten nerve of identity and courage, came alive in the people. They replied that they would start rebuilding. And so they began. The moment the work started, the attack started. First came mockery. Sanballat gathered his officials and openly ridiculed the project. He laughed at the idea that these people could restore anything. He said that if even a fox climbed on their wall, it would crumble. It was designed to demoralize, to make the workers feel small, foolish, deluded. But Nehemiah didn't argue. He prayed, and the work continued. When mockery failed, the opposition turned to conspiracy. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem formed an alliance with surrounding peoples, Arabs, Ammonites, people of Ashdod, and together they plotted to march on Jerusalem and kill the builders. Nehemiah's response was extraordinary in its practicality. He split his workforce in 2. Half continued building. Half stood armed, shields on their arms, swords at their sides. The builders worked with one hand and held a weapon with the other. From that day forward, no one put down their tools without a sword strapped to their side. But even that wasn't the lowest moment. The lowest moment came from inside. Nehemiah's own people began to break. The poor among them had been borrowing money to survive during the project. Creditors, wealthy Jews among them, were charging interest, seizing fields, selling children into servitude to recover debts. Nehemiah was furious, not at the enemy outside the walls, at the exploitation happening within his own community. He called a public assembly. He confronted the nobles and officials directly. He demanded the debts be canceled, the fields returned, the interest given back. And to their credit, the nobles agreed, and the work continued. Then came the final play. With the wall nearly complete, Sanballat tried something different. He sent a message inviting Nehemiah to meet. He sent it 5 times. 5 times, Nehemiah replied the same way, that he was carrying on a great project and could not come down, that the work would not stop. He knew what the invitation really was, an attempt to lure him away, to isolate him, possibly to harm him. When that failed, Sanballat sent an open letter accusing Nehemiah of planning a rebellion, of wanting to make himself king. It was a smear campaign, classic political intimidation. Nehemiah's response was simple. He told them they were making it up, and then he went back to work. 52 days. That is how long it took. 52 days from the first stone laid to the final gate hung. The walls of Jerusalem stretched for roughly 2.5 miles. They had been in ruins for over 100 years. And a group of civilians, merchants, priests, goldsmiths, perfume makers, and ordinary families rebuilt them in less than 2 months, while being actively threatened, while managing internal conflict, while working with one hand and holding a weapon with the other. When the wall was finished, the surrounding nations were afraid. The book of Nehemiah records it plainly. When all the enemies heard about it, all the surrounding nations lost their confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of God, not with an army, not with Persian gold, with ordinary people who showed up every day and refused to stop. And then something remarkable happened. The people gathered in the public square and asked Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law. They stood for hours, from daybreak until noon, and listened as it was read aloud. And they wept, not from grief, from recognition. They wept because they heard the words and understood who they were again. They had lost more than walls. They had lost their identity. And in the rebuilding of those stones, they had found their way back to themselves. Here is what Nehemiah's story is actually about. It is not a story about bricks and mortar. It is a story about what one person can do when they refuse to believe that a broken thing must stay broken. Think about what Nehemiah was on paper. Not a general, not a prophet, not a king, a cupbearer, a man whose job was to stand quietly in the background while others lived their lives of power. He had every reason to stay where he was. He had comfort, security, the king's favor. But he looked at the ruins of his people's past and asked a question that changed everything. What if I'm the one? Not what if someone does something. What if I do? Every piece of opposition he faced, the mockery, the conspiracies, the threats, the smear campaigns, the internal conflicts, the exhaustion, every single one of them was an invitation to stop. And every single time, he chose to keep building. There is something in the human soul that recognizes this story, because we have all stood before something broken. A relationship, a community, a calling, a version of yourself you left behind somewhere. Something that was supposed to be strong, but is now rubble. And we have all heard the voice, internal or external, that says it is too far gone, that the opposition is too great, that you are the wrong person, that it will never be restored. Nehemiah stood before literal rubble, with real enemies, with a real empire that could have crushed him. And he picked up a stone, and he started building. 52 days later, the wall was finished. The gates were hung. The people wept with recognition. And the nations that had mocked and threatened and conspired looked at what had been accomplished and were afraid. Not because of the walls, because of what the walls proved. That broken things can be rebuilt. That ordinary people, faithfully committed to an extraordinary purpose, can accomplish what the powerful insist is impossible. That one person, the right person, willing to weep and pray and work and stand firm, can change everything. Whatever wall in your life has been lying in rubble, maybe it is time to pick up the stone.